Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to another MLFL. And this week we're very excited to have Maria De-Arteaga, who is an assistant professor at the Information Risk and Operation Management Department at UT Austin. And she's also a faculty member at the Machine Learning Laboratory. Before joining UT Austin, she received a joint PhD in ML and public policy from CMU. And her research mainly focuses on the risks and opportunities of using ML for decision support in high-stakes settings. She's received a lot of awards in the last few years, most notably a Best Thematic Paper at NACL 2019 and a 2020 Google Award for Inclusion Research. And in 2017, she co-founded the Machine Learning for the Developing World workshop, ML4D at NeurIPS. So without further delay, let's get started. If people have questions, feel free to leave them on the chat or raise your hand, and I will interrupt Maria at the end of a slide whenever I see those questions. And yeah, over to you, Maria.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Very excited to be here. Today, I'll be presenting to you work that we presented earlier this year at CHI, the main HCI conference, titled For Humans in the Loop, Decisions in the Presence of Erroneous Algorithmic Scores. And this is joint work with Ricardo Fogliato and Alexandra Sholochova, both at CMU. So in recent years, we have seen an increase in the use of machine learning for decision support in high-stakes settings. Examples of these include machine learning assisting physicians in patients' diagnosis and prognosis, helping a human resources team determine who should they recruit, who should they hire. We've seen the use in criminal justice system and in assisting call workers determine which calls concerning potential child neglect or abuse should be screened in for investigation. And one thing that while these tools are being used for decision support, typically the locus of evaluation is still the machine learning model and its prediction performance. And these headlines illustrate it very well. It's saying, oh, AI is doing better than humans at this task. AI can beat humans. However, and in doing so, when we're doing these, we're focused on kind of like this portion of the pipeline. So we pay a lot of attention to how does the training data look like and how that impacts the predictions. What is the objective function that we should be optimizing for? This is kind of like the snapshot of the pipeline that we're focused on when we're doing these. However, what we often care about is not the predictions, but the prediction-informed decisions. So there's a lot of cases where, and the cases that I just mentioned are examples of these, where the machine is not making an autonomous decision, but it is supporting a human expert that will then make the decision. What that does is that it really expands the portion, like the pipeline that we care about. And so suddenly we don't just care about those portions that concern the algorithm, but we care about how that impacts the decision process, how incentives and constraints in the social context that the decision maker is embedded in influence their decisions. And there's of course the fact that it's no longer a static setting, but the AI-assisted decisions will then go on to affect the data that we observe in the future. And so before we go on, isn't full automation a matter of time? Some of you may be thinking, well, you know, this is just like a temporary problem. We'll soon just be doing full automation. But that's not really the case. And some of the reasons why is, first and foremost, there are many decisions that are not solely based on prediction. There's a lot of cases where the decision that a human expert is making is not just about predicting the most likely outcome. And here, there's also another element that is some tasks have inherent uncertainty associated to it. So there are diagnostic tasks where there's kind of like a ground truth that we could aim to predict, but there are prognostic tasks, especially those concerning future human behavior, where we simply cannot aim to have a system that will perfectly predict whether someone will commit a crime, unless we subscribe to a notion of humans have no autonomy over their decisions and actions. And in addition to these, the outcomes that we're optimizing for, even in tasks that we typically think are very well defined, such as cancer diagnosis, where we can imagine like we have very clear labels, the truth is that these constructs are very ill-defined, and there's not really a gold standard that we can optimize for. There's a great piece by Adamson that elaborates on this program that I have a picture of it here, the perspective on the New England Journal of Medicine. And in addition to these, there's a lot of other information that is important to the humans. So what we term usually unobservables to the algorithm, that lead to the human being able to incorporate that information when we frame the task as decision support. So at the core of my research is what are the risks and the opportunities of using machine learning for decision support? And how should these inform algorithmic design? Within these, some of my work looks at algorithmic fairness. Some of it looks at how do we optimize for the constructs that matter, and how do we improve expert decisions and not just predictions. At the center of all this being human-centered ML. For today's focus, we're going to look at one question that is, are humans capable of making good use of algorithmic recommendations to improve decisions? So everything else I told you 2 slides ago of why we want to frame the task as decision support and not as an automated task relies on the assumption that humans are actually going to be able to make use of this information that the algorithm is giving the human. If it turns out that as humans, we're really bad at that, then all of these gains that we hypothesize on building the task as decision support and not as an autonomous task will not be realized. And so in thinking about whether humans are capable of making good use of algorithmic recommendations, we can frame the problem as looking at 2 particular phenomena. That is algorithm aversion and automation bias. So these can be thought of as 2 ends of a spectrum of how humans make use of recommendations provided by an algorithmic system. And neither of these is what we would want to happen. So in algorithmic aversion, we have a phenomenon of undercompliance. So this leads humans to disregard the machine even when the recommendation provided is useful. And even if you've shown the human evidence that the information is useful. On the other side of the task, we have automation bias. And in algorithm aversion, I should mention one of the elements that has been most studied is the fact that humans are often willing to trust other humans more, even if they know that the machine, even if they have some evidence that the machine may be more accurate. Some of the reasons that give rise to this is once the humans have seen the algorithm making mistakes, they lose trust, the desire to have some control over the output, the lack of time to inspect what the algorithm is suggesting to them. On the other end of the spectrum, we have automation bias, that is overcompliance. One domain where this was very deeply studied is when high-tech cockpits were first deployed on planes. And what was found was that pilots were suddenly way more likely to miss things that they would typically identify because they were overly relying on the automated system. And so here we can have 2 types of errors. We can have omission errors, where what happens is that the human fails to detect problematic cases because they're not incorporating these outer sources of information, or commission errors. So in the clinical setting, for example, that could lead a clinician to prescribe an invasive procedure that was not necessary because the algorithm suggested it. So today's focus, a little bit refined, is, are experts able to dismiss algorithmic recommendations when the tool misestimates the risk? And in particular, we're going to be looking at risk assessment instruments. So risk assessment instruments are algorithmic tools that what they're doing is they're estimating the likelihood that a person or case will have poor outcomes. And so examples of where this is being deployed or considered for deployment is lending, so predicting the probability that someone will repay a loan, criminal justice system, predicting whether a person is likely to commit an act of recidivism, healthcare, so here it may be predicting whether someone may have a negative outcome down the line, and child welfare, that will be today's focus, in which we're looking at assisting call workers in identifying cases to a hotline of child abuse where the child may be at risk. So let's look a little bit at the background of the domain. So in the US, it is estimated that 37.4% of children experience a child protective services investigation by the age of 18. These amounts to approximately 4 million calls that we term referrals received to child abuse and maltreatment hotlines that involve over 7 million children. And that leads to approximately 3.5 million children that receive an investigation or some form of response by the system. This is nationwide. In Allegheny County, the county where Pittsburgh is located, and is where we study the deployment of a risk assessment tool, here we can look at the overview of how the pipeline works. So basically, the call worker receives a call, they have access to the information communicated in the call, and they can also access historical records. So there's this data warehouse that has been made available by the county. And so here they can look at past interactions with public services, past interactions with the prison system, and a lot of other information from different offices in the county. Based on these, they need to determine whether a call is screened in for investigation. If the call is screened in for investigation, what this means is that a social worker visits the home and different outcomes may take place. So services may be offered to the family, or the child may, after an investigation, the child may be placed out of the home. And in the case of screen out, there's no investigation that is open. So the high volume of calls means that not all calls can be investigated. In addition to these, there's an argument to be made that is you may not want to investigate all calls because opening an investigation places a high burden on the family. So you have an incentive to not incur in false positives. However, the cost of false negatives can lead to fatal outcomes for the child. So because the information communicated in a call may sometimes be ambiguous, so you can imagine teacher calling and saying something like, well, my student has been behaving a little bit weird, feel like something's off, so do you open an investigation or not? And after having some very negative outcomes that attracted a lot of national attention in the 90s in Allegheny County, what the county did was they started creating this data warehouse that I mentioned. The challenge there is this led to them giving coworkers to like 800 variables. And turns out as humans, we're not great at parsing 800 variables and making decisions based on these. And so that led to an interest in using risk assessment tools as a way to make use of these mass amounts of information and kind of summarize this data for the call workers. And some people are very optimistic about this, in particular local agencies are hopeful that this will reduce the number of high-risk cases that are missed. Some people are very concerned about this. In her book, Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks devotes a whole chapter to looking at the Allegheny County risk assessment tool. And the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform published a commentary titled, Pittsburgh's Child Welfare Agency Goes Full Orwell. So this is an outcome pipeline of how the system looks like when the predictive model was deployed. So in addition to having the call, having the historical information, which is an important element that the call workers still have access to the raw historical information, those records are fed into this predictive model that provides the call workers with a risk score that is a number between 1 and 20. And for some cases, those that are predicted to be at very high risk of out-of-home placement. Out-of-home placement means that the child is placed out of the home. That can be foster care or with other members of the family. For those cases, there's a red flag. That means that if the call worker wants to screen out of the call, then they need supervisory's approval. So at the core of these, for us to understand, going back to this question of what are the implications of using these systems, a fundamental element is how are call workers making use of this information? And in particular, we want to ask, are call workers able to dismiss algorithmic recommendations when the tool misestimates the risk? And here, again, we frame this between the risks of algorithm aversion and automation bias. If there was algorithm aversion, then it's a waste of public resources. We shouldn't be investing efforts into an algorithm that is going to be ignored. If there's automation bias, there could be a very big problem in which the call workers are just relying on the algorithm that if we look at here, the algorithm is just looking at the historical records. The algorithm is not seeing the information communicated in the call, for example. And so the call workers may be just like blindly relying on the algorithm and missing cases where the algorithm makes a mistake. The findings that I'll now walk you through, but the key findings that of our research is call workers did alter their behavior when using algorithmic recommendations. So there was not a case of algorithm aversion, complete algorithm aversion. You can think about it as like the behavior of humans falling somewhere in this spectrum. And they are less likely to adhere to recommendations that result from misestimated scores. And in a second, I'll tell you about how what are these misestimated scores that I'm talking about. So to understand that, we can first look at the timeline and the predictive model that is used by the county. So the data from before 2014 was data that was used for training the model. So this is the data that is fed into the predictive model that I'll describe in a second. Then for the purpose of our study, we have data from the beginning of 2015 to the middle of 2016, where we can observe the behavior of the humans pre-deployment without that being confounded with the data that was used for training. And then we can look at between August 2016 to December 2017, what is the post-deployment behavior? So how were humans making use of the algorithmic tool? Importantly, our timeline ends in December 2017, because at this time, the county realized that there was a glitch in the system that was leading to some features being miscalculated in real time. That is what gave rise to the misestimated scores. Before I explain these more in detail, so what the predictive model has is it takes as input the administrative records, again, no information from the code, and it predicts two outcomes with different models. So there's one model that predicts the probability of out-of-home placement of the child, another model that predicts the probability of a future referral. So that is another call concerning the same child in the future. And based on those two outcomes, the decision support tool provides two elements to the call worker. A risk score that is calculated as the maximum score between these two, and a mandatory screening that is a red flag that says if the score of out-of-home placement, not the maximum score that they're seeing, is 18 or higher, then you need a supervisor's approval if you want to not screen this call for investigation. However, as I mentioned, they realized in December 2017 that some features were being miscalculated in real time. the glitch was not random. And importantly, we cannot reconstruct the glitch. And here you can get a little bit of a sense of what the glitch looked like. So there's a lot of cases were not affected by the glitch. So I'll show in a second, for a lot of scores, the scores were still aligned. But when you look at those that were affected, they were affected in different directions. Like some features that were supposed to be non-zero became zero. Some features that were zero became non-zero. So summary of the glitch: discovered in 2017, not a random glitch, and we cannot reconstruct the glitch. And so what did the glitch do to the scores? In the x-axis here, we're looking at the assessed score. So this is the correct score. So if we do the retrospective analysis, so we take the algorithm that was deployed and we calculate the score based on the correct features, this is the score that should have been shown. The y-axis, we have the score that was actually shown. So the fact that you see these diagonal, very highly colored, what it means is that for most cases, the score shown aligned with the score that should have been shown. So for the most part, the glitch did not affect the scores, but there were 17% of shown scores that were miscalculated by 5 or more points. And an important point for our analysis is the fact that many cases that should have been flagged as mandatory screening were not. And so this glitch allows us to understand how co-workers behaved when the score shown was misestimated. And in particular, whether they were less likely to adhere to incorrect scores. Before we analyze that, though, we need to see, well, what happened before and after? Did the deployment of the tool impact co-workers' decision, or did they simply ignore recommendations? So basically, we want to see whether algorithm aversion took place, and any relationship that we see afterwards is just the co-workers continue to do what they had always been doing. So what we're seeing here is in the x-axis, the score, and in the y-axis, the screening rate. So in purple, you see the score post-deployment. In orange, yellow, I don't know what color is that, pre-deployment. And so what this means, an important thing here is that this is the assessed score. So as I mentioned, we cannot reconstruct the glitch. So we can not look at what the misestimated score would have been before deployment, right? We cannot say, oh, for this case that the tool didn't see when it had the glitch, what would it have been calculated with the error? But the important thing to note here is that if the co-workers had continued to make decisions how they always had made decisions, then we should see that the calibration between the scores and the screening rate should have been the same. If deployment had not influenced the behavior of co-workers at all, then we should observe that the screening rate for each level of scores should not have changed pre and post deployment. However, what we see here is that post deployment, the screenings are better aligned with the score. And in particular, you can see that for like the ends of the distribution, right? So like the cases that we're screening as very low or very high. So these, and one thing to note here is that the overall screening rate did not vary in the two periods. It's approximately 45%, likely because this screening rate is determined by resource constraints. So summary of what we learned from this plot is that the decisions became better aligned, better calibrated with the score post-deployment. Here we look at those cases that should have been flagged as mandatory screenings. Again, we cannot reproduce the glitch before, but there's a strong correlation between those that should have had a mandatory screening and those that did. And in the period before deployment, cases that would have fallen in the category of mandatory screening had a screening rate of 58%, while after deployment, this rate increased to 71%. And so the increase is smaller than what would be expected if automation bias were to occur. That is something important to note, that is there's still not like a perfect adherence. In even though there's a cost barrier to overriding the machine. And so here, basically in these two slides, all we need to learn from this is the call workers didn't just continue business as usual and completely ignored the algorithm. They made use of the algorithm in some way to update their decisions. So what happened afterwards? Now we can start looking at a little bit more of the fine-grained behaviors. So the core question here is, are call workers able to dismiss algorithmic recommendations when the tool misestimates the risk? Or do they blindly follow recommendations? So if there was automation bias going on, what we should see is that the adherence to the score is the same, regardless of whether the score was a correct estimation or an incorrect estimation of the score. So here we're looking at assessed versus shown scores. So this is a plot that is very similar to the one that I showed you before. Again, x-axis, the scores, y-axis is screening rates. So here we're looking at calibration between score and screening rates, and looking at comparing the shown score with the assessed score. And the important thing to note here is that, interestingly, the decisions are better aligned with the assessed score than with the shown score, which is not what we would expect if the call workers were blindly adhering to the shown score. In particular, when you look at the two extremes that are highlighted there, what you find is that for those scores that were miscalculated and shown as very low, right, like aggregated, we see that there's still approximately 30% of cases that were screened in, even though they had a very low shown score. And similarly, for the very high end, we see that there's a better alignment with the assessed than the shown score. So what this suggests is that the call workers are effectively using information at their disposal to avoid many errors of omission when we look at the low end of this plot. But here we're looking at everything in aggregate. So we cannot see what happens when the score is underestimated, what happens when the score is overestimated. So here we can look at these by buckets. So here what we have is, in the x-axis, we have now buckets of scores. So the score shown, so the score shown between 1 and 5, 6 and 10, so on. And again, screening rates in the y-axis. So what happens when the score is misestimated, and in particular when it is underestimated? So this plot shows the percentage of screenings for a binned version of the shown score. And so correct indicates that the assessed score is equal to the shown score. Underestimation means that the score shown was lower than the assessed score. And overestimation means that the score shown was higher than the assessed score. So if coworkers were to blindly follow the risk tool, we would observe that within each of these score buckets, the screening rates are the same across all three cases. If the coworkers are just relying on the score, then the overestimated, correct, and underestimated should be undistinguishable. And what we observe is actually something very different. So among cases with similar shown scores, cases for which the score was underestimated are screened in at much higher rates than the others. This means that the humans are at the aggregate level able to identify that the risk is being underestimated for these cases. So how do we read this plot exactly? So for example, for the cases with a shown score between 11 and 15, those for which the score was an underestimation of the assessed score were screened in at a rate of almost 60%, is what you can see here in the box. Meanwhile, the other cases with a shown score between 11 and 15 were screening at rates around 30%. Again, this suggests that the call workers make use of other pieces of information, either from the call or from the administrative data that they can query. Basically, when they queried the raw features, the glitch was not affecting that. So if they chose to look at the features that were the input to the model, they could see the correct features. And so they're somehow making use of these other sources of information and responding appropriately by screening in with higher probability. However, one thing that we're not seeing in this plot is this does not differentiate between different magnitudes of misestimation, right? Here, when we see one of these beams, we don't know if those that were overestimated or underestimated were by 3 points or by 10, right? So that is what we can look at more in detail here. So we can investigate these by studying the decisions made for cases that should have been flagged for mandatory screenings in the absence of the glitch, but that were not flagged as such. So what you're seeing in this plot is the proportion of cases with assessed mandatory screening that were actually screened in for each bucket of shown scores. So the first bucket, the 1 to 5, are cases that if there had not been a glitch, the score of out-of-home placement would have been 18 or higher, but the score that was shown was between 1 and 5. And what we see here is that you can see that the screening rate is approximately constant across all buckets. And what this suggests is that the underestimation of the assessed score has virtually no effect on the co-workers' actions for these high-risk cases. Even when the shown placement score was more than 12 points lower than the assessed placement score, the screening was still as likely as for shown mandatory cases. So what these findings suggest is that, again, the call workers are making use of other pieces of information, either from the call or from the administrative data, and are responding appropriately. So again, we come to our core findings that are in the first portion. I showed you how call workers did alter their behavior when using the algorithmic recommendations, and they didn't continue business as usual. But in how they were making use of the algorithmic recommendations, they were less likely to adhere to recommendations that resulted from a misestimated score. And so I'll pause a little bit to go back to our initial motivation of looking at this. And when we look at how humans make use of algorithmic decision support tools, there's some results that are lead us to be very pessimistic and is grounded on reality of what we see in some domains. That is, well, humans sometimes are worse. Like there's some results that show that when you give humans a score and you tell them the accuracy of the model, like how good it is, they're still worse. The combination of the algorithm and the human is still worse with respect to what you care about than the human alone. There's like all of these negative results of humans. We're terrible at using these risk assessment tools, terrible at using this decision support. And so what that means is that those hopes that we have for decision support tools of humans making use of unobservables, making use of understanding between the gap of what the algorithm is optimizing for and what they care about, those may not be realized if we just cannot incorporate these different sources of information. And what we find here is that in this particular case, humans were actually displaying a behavior that is quite desirable. It's kind of like what we could aspire to in terms of humans not completely dismissing the algorithmic recommendations, but still making use of them in a way that is like we could term as critical and still looking at other sources of information that complement their decisions. The question there is then, well, what went right? What is it that we should keep on doing that they did, right? And that's where things, yeah.
Yeah, so we had a couple of questions on the previous slide. Mm-hmm. So Karishma, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. So, hi, Maria. First of all, this is really interesting, and kudos for all this, like the system and the paper. So, I just wanted to ask, like, while you were creating this system, like, how did you calculate the accuracy of the system, or these? How did you, the objective function was thought of? Because what I could think of right now is just the human-based score or the results. So how did you compare in your system your assessment scores with to like improve the system or fine tune while training it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that I will emphasize and clarify is that we did not create the system. So our task here was auditing of the system that was deployed by the county. There's a paper that gives you all of the details of the system. There's two places where you can find all of the details of the system. There's a paper, let me see if I can find it. Well, I'll link it afterwards. That was at FACT. It actually won a best paper at FACT 2000, the first iteration of FACT. And that one describes the details. So that's the first thing that I want to emphasize, that is, we did not create the system. We were just auditing the system. And what you had as the question was, how was the performance evaluated? So this goes to what was it that they were using as the target outcome. So here they were looking at out-of-home placement and future referral. So as I mentioned, the data is trained, the model is trained with data from until 2014. And so they look at, for those calls, which were calls that in the 200 and something days following the call, there was an out-of-home placement of the child, which could have been triggered by that specific call or by something else down the line, right? And so those are the labels that they were using. Same for whether there was a future referral. And those are the labels against which they evaluated the performance of the system. So the system is evaluated with respect to its ability to predict these outcomes. There's some analysis that if we have time, I can go into, that I have it in some extra slides, where we looked at what can we say about the quality of the decisions, where it's not super straightforward to evaluate, because you have, first, you have a selective labels problem. That is, you only observe outcomes for the cases that are screened in for investigation. So you're never going to have an out-of-home placement of a child that you never screened in for investigation. And second, you also have problems of omitted payoff biases and treatment effects. So there could be cases where you screened in a case for investigation, and the visit of the social worker to the home by itself reduced the risk. Like, that visit could constitute an intervention. And so what you observe is, oh, this didn't result in an out-of-home placement, is a low-risk case. But it's not, because if you hadn't screened it in, then you wouldn't have had these desirable effects. So in other paper that I hope to share soon, I look at kind of like this disconnect between the out-of-home placement objective and other constructs that you may care about. And again, if we have time, I'll go a little bit into the details of what we can say about the decisions themselves in outcomes of interest.
Just one more question. So, like, as you said that you were auditing the system, and you guys assessed the fact that 17% of the scores were a little mismatched. So was there any specific reason that you could find out for that? Because what I could understand, like the system was trained on the same historical records as the human would use to predict. So was there any specific reason for the mismatch in the assessment by this huge of a score, like more than 5 points?
Yeah, so this was a glitch so this was a technical glitch in the system. So what happened was that the database queries were off. And so when the system was querying the features in real time to say something like, oh, have there been previous referrals concerning this child? Or is there any history of X for the adults involved in this call? In that query of the database, that's where the glitch was. And so what happened was that the input features to the algorithm, some of them were miscalculated in real time. And that is what led to this misestimation of the score. And so again, what I mean when I talk about the misestimation is with respect to what the score should have been based on that algorithm. So we're not talking about like a ground truth here, but it's simply if there hadn't been a glitch, if the features had been populated correctly, what should have been the score? And what was the actual score that was shown based on just a glitch in the query of the features?
Thank you.
So, so Maria, we have one more question now. So I was wondering how much content is left, and based on that, we can decide whether to take it now.
No,
or
let's take it. Let's take it. Yeah.
Take it now. Okay. Okay. Katie.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is such a fascinating talk, and I love the way that you're formulating algorithmic aversion versus automation bias. And so I apologize if I missed this, but could you talk a little bit about how the decision makers the workers are actually trained, and do you have a hypothesis that the training the workers receive about what the algorithm's outputs are, if that could also influence any sorts of errors they're making in their decision to take a call or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm actually going to talk about this in the next slide.
Perfect.
So if it sounds good to you, I'll table it for now. If when we get to that slide, there's still questions that you have, please ask them again and we can comment on that, because that is, yeah, that's the focus of the coming slides. That is, what is it about this system that may have led to this behavior? And definitely, I think that the way that workers were trained may play an important role.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions? Because this is a perfect place to take a pause and ask about like the results that I just showed. So anyone else has any questions, or should we continue?
So I don't see any raised hands or chat messages. So maybe we can continue and then take more questions at the end.
Perfect.
On this part, yeah. So
as Katie brought up, the question here is, well, what are the lessons learned? We saw this desirable behavior. What was it about the system or the way that the co-workers were trained that was leading to this? So the retrospective nature of our study offers a rare opportunity to study a phenomenon that would otherwise not be ethically feasible to investigate. And importantly, by virtue of being a study of a real deployed system, our study has the advantage of having inherent field validity. And that is a particularly important characteristic when we're looking at such a high stakes setting. Even if we were to replicate and say, okay, we have the resources to have the call workers that would usually take this call, let's simulate what they would be doing, kind of like a training setup, and ask what would be your decisions in this case, that still doesn't have inherent field validity, because how call workers say that they would react or think that they would react when they see a certain call with a certain information may be very different than how they actually react when they know that a child's life may be at stake. So this high stake nature of this task means that the inherent field validity of this study is particularly important for us to be able to say, this is how the call workers actually behave, right? However, because the study is retrospective and the corruption was systematic, it wasn't random, we cannot establish causality, and we can only speculate what led to this behavior based on conversations with country staff. And there's actually, we have a short paper on a workshop. So everything that I just showed you, it was at KAIN, the main conference, and then we have this short paper discussing some of the lessons from the deployment. And so what are some of these lessons? First, there's important implications in terms of auditing of the tool. And some elements worth noting are that the discovery of the glitch was only possible because the team responsible for deployment has engaged in continuous auditing of the tool. So this glitch was discovered by the county themselves in just the continuous auditing in which they were looking at things, and they just saw, oh, this looks off, something must be off here, and they start investigating and they found the glitch. So that continuous auditing, it's important to be able to identify potential risks and mistakes. The other element is that the audit of the decision process should be periodic instead of a one-time audit. Right now, especially when we're talking about fairness considerations and so on, we often think about these one-time audits before deployment, and then that's it. But it's important that we audit the tool continuously and in the framework in which the tool is embedded. And another element about the audit is that recurrent audits and engagement of stakeholders in this case. So there is, I think it's also a CHI paper, a CSCW paper that discusses some of these engagements of stakeholders in this particular domain that have been led by the team that created and deployed the tool, which is led by a team from New Zealand. And they've engaged in continuous audits with the stakeholders. And this involves families that are under investigation, the social workers that assist families when they're being investigated. And an important element of this is that these increased audits of involving stakeholders may have led to increased vigilance of co-workers to potential mistakes of the tool. And the other element to talk about, and this speaks more to your question, Katie, is what are factors during deployment that may have had an effect? So one is the availability of data sources, the fact that here from the data that I just showed you, we cannot determine whether the external data that the call workers were using was from the information communicated in the call alone, or also from them going and looking at the raw features. But it is possible that having access to the administrative data that was not affected by the glitch is part of what led to this behavior that we're seeing here. Importantly, and this goes to the third point in this bullet list, I'll come back to the second, is that the call workers had experience with making decisions without the tool. And so in particular, when it goes to making use of the raw data, that may have a lot of implications, because the fact that they were used to parsing this data, to navigating these like 800 features, and even if they were not doing it in like an optimal way, maybe, they still had practice with these, and how did they make decisions without the tool? And so one important question is the behavior that I just showed you. Would this behavior be the same when all call workers that are working in receiving calls from the hotline started working there once the predictive algorithm was deployed? Or would we see something else? And if so, how should that inform training processes in which we train experts to make decisions without the tool? And another element here is the task design and the instructions. So the instructions are explicitly that they should treat the score as complementary. And in particular, the instructions say you shouldn't take low risk scores as you shouldn't screening the call. This is just telling you, oh, there's information from the historical records that means that there may be flags for a high risk score. And so a lot of the training has placed the emphasis on these high scores, not on making decisions based solely on the low scores. And so these may have had an important impact, the fact that the instructions are to treat the score as complementary. And there's actually a very, I don't know if any of you have read Automating Inequality, but there's a very nice portion in which Eubanks is describing how she's working with a call worker and they're looking at 2 calls, and the call worker asks her like, okay, which call, like what are the scores you think these calls are gonna have? And the author is making the predictions a lot based on the information in the call. And the call worker says like, no, these are my predictions basically. And when they run the tool to show the scores, the call worker predicted the scores quite well. which that is, I mean, this is very anecdotal, but it's kind of like this, what I mean by these task design and instructions, that is this ability to understand what are observables and unobservables to the algorithm and what is the algorithm predicting. And so that portion of task design and instructions that explicitly tell the coworkers to use the tool as complementary are very important. And finally, one question here is, we often talk about the importance of explainability in these settings, but here in this case, there was no explanations. And while we typically think of explanations as desirable, there's a chance that they could have actually misled the users into over-relying on the tool. And this bullet point is based on research by that is suggested by Hima Lakkaraju, and also there's paper from folks at Microsoft Research recently that look at how explanations can lead users to over-rely on algorithmic tools. And so the question here of, was the absence of explanations good? Was the fact that they were just seeing these scores and this flag part of what led them to have this behavior that we can characterize as desirable? And to summarize, in future work, the core of what we're looking at is, can we assess which factors contributed to the desirable behavior in experimental setups where we have more control over what we're varying and where we can make causal claims? And with this, I'll open it up to more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. Let's all unmute ourselves and thank the speaker before we take questions. Okay, so we have time for questions. So people who have questions, enter them in the chat or raise your hand on the participant list. Before we start, Katie, do you want to follow up on the question you had during the talk? Okay, maybe we can just go ahead with the questions we have. James, do you want to get started?
Hi, so I was just curious. Do you know like exactly like what types of fields like the model was trained on to make those predictions in the historical records?
So you mean, do we know which were the features that the algorithm was giving the most weight to in its predictions?
Yeah, just like what types of fields like were in that data?
Yeah, so the data that the algorithm makes use of and that the coworkers also have access to includes things like previous interactions with public services. So this includes things like use of mental health resources, use of basically anything that counts as public services. There's also information of previous interactions with the Child Protective Service Agency. These are the ones that receive the highest weight by the model. So whether there has been previous investigations, whether there have been previous negative outcomes of investigations. There's information about interactions with with the jail system. So whether any of the adults involved in the call have been imprisoned, whether the children involved in the call, like what is the information. So it's basically like all of these data that the county has access to that is pulled together into this predictive model.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a question on the chat. Akriti, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Great talk, Maria. I just wanted to understand how adding the tool helped the workers, because like you said, they were instructed to use it as a complementary score and not rely on it completely. So did adding the tool improve the efficiency of the call workers, or what was the main reason that that was added? Yeah.
Perfect, so we can go to the complementary slides to look at what we can say about these. So this is your question, right? It's like, how did algorithmic recommendations impact the decisions? And so when we look at the pipeline, so far I showed you what happened up to screen in and screen out of calls. But after this stage, what happens is that if the call screening for investigation, a social worker visits the family, and there's 3 potential outcomes that you can have there. There may be an investigation that is open based on that visit. It can be linked to an existing case, or it may be the case that no investigation is open. And then once this is determined, then there may be services offered to the family. There may be, again, an out-of-home placement that results from it. So here we're looking at, based on the, so pre-deployment and post-deployment, from these obviously are just from the calls that were screened in, right? So this is looking at, for the calls that were screened in, what was the breakdown of open investigation, linked to existing case, and do not open investigation. And what we find, what these results suggest, is that there's a higher precision post-deployment. So post-deployment, the calls that are screened in for investigation, meaning a social worker visits the home, is more likely that once that social worker visits the home, they determine that an investigation should be open. And here what we're looking at is the score shown. So in the x-axis, we have the buckets that we have seen before, and the accepted cases, right? So accepted for investigation, like when I said open investigation, it's like it's accepted for investigation. And we see again this phenomenon on the underestimation, correct, and overestimation. So what this suggests is that the cases where there's underestimation of the score, this plot, if you remember, looks extremely similar to that of the call workers over screening rates. So those calls where the score was an underestimation were screened in at higher rates. And what this table now is showing us is that they were not only screening at higher rates, the coworker was not only deciding to screen them in at higher rates, but they were also more likely to be accepted for investigation. So what this table now suggests in that is that in those cases where the call workers were dismissing the misestimated, the underestimated score, they were kind of correct. It was more likely that an investigation would be open. And one important thing here to consider is that these results suggest that the deployment of the tool does lead to more investigations being accepted, and we can see that as, oh, that's good, because presumably those cases that are accepted for services are the ones that we should be investigating. There's a lot of complexity to these because there's a lot of cases in which, for example, elements that are just like conditions of living in poverty warrant sometimes a case being accepted for investigation. So you may still be having some elements here that are concerning. And we look a little bit here at whether the algorithm exacerbates disparities. And so in particular, we looked at racial disparities and socioeconomic disparities. So here, what we're seeing the screening rates for Black and white children. And this is before and after the deployment of the tool. We see that there's a slight reduction on screening rates for Black children and slight increase for whites, but it doesn't seem to be super significant. Prior work has identified differences in overrides across groups as a source of disparity. So there's a particular concern when you have a decision support system, and it's that you don't only care about the impact of the predictions, but what happens if the expert is just way more likely to update their priors in one case than in the others? And so we analyze if there is a difference in alignment with the assessed mandatory policy. So whether those cases that said, oh, you really need to screen in the case, whether that alignment differed in this breakdown. And so this is what we're seeing on the right in this figure. So here you're seeing the screening rates for the subset of cases that should have been flagged as mandatory. And we see that the screening rates for both groups increase, although the increase may be slightly sharper for white children. And what these results indicate is that unlike what has been observed in other domains, there does not appear to be a difference in the willingness to adhere to recommendations that would compound previous racial injustices. And because the features that are available for risk assessment rely in part with previous interactions with public services, one of the biggest concerns here is what happens if this just means that those seeking government support in the past are punished by the tool. Because in particular, when you're looking at things like mental health, one of the characteristics of the system is that you only observe mental health history if the person needed to go to government-assisted mental health. If you've paid for private mental health, the county has no idea. And so there's the risk that that would also compound previous injustices. We looked at these in, so here you're looking at the households below the poverty rate. And so what you're looking at here is among assessed mandatory screening rates, there does not appear to be a correlation between the neighborhood poverty levels and the willingness to adhere to these recommendations. So like here, basically, if it was the case that again, like we're concerned with these willingness to adhere to the recommendations and with the screening rates. And what these results find is that when we look at screening rates by poverty rates, defined as a percentage of households below the poverty level in the person's neighborhood. By the way, I should clarify that in how this is defined, we find that the screening rates don't appear to correlate. So this is some preliminary evidence looking at the fact that first in these plots, it does seem to suggest that the decision support tool is leading to a higher precision post-deployment of the tool, and that is not driven by compounding previous injustices. However, this is not meant to be conclusive evidence to say, oh yeah, green light, there's no problems, go ahead, because as I said, there's a lot of challenges in what we measure here and what we cannot measure. So there could be harms that we're not observing through this lens that I just presented.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a question from Karishma.
Hi, Maria. So I just wanted to ask, like, are there any improvements made on this existing system to mitigate these disparities? And if yes, I would really like to know how did you or how the like the creators of the system handle that?
Yeah, so what we're seeing in the results that I just showed is that there doesn't seem to be a problem with disparities, both in terms of how that leads to the screenings and in terms of the willingness to adhere. And part of what the county has said on their part is that some of the elements of the previous history may actually be seen as positive by the tool. So it's very concerning if it's like, oh, any interaction with the public services is going to increase your risk. That is not necessarily the case. It could be that it says like, oh, you're actually like very good at seeking out help. So like that makes you a lower risk case. So that's kind of like the explanation that the county has given on why that may not be a problem. But yeah, what these results, again, very preliminary evidence, very thorough analysis that look at meaningful endpoints need to be looked at. But what this suggests in terms of effects on compounding previous injustices is that the tool is not having that phenomenon of compounding disparities.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Feel free to put it on the chat or raise your hand. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Okay, I think we can wrap it up. So let's all unmute ourselves once again and thank the speaker for the great talk. And I will stop recording.